Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here with you, and it feels a bit, feels like it's another day because I left my home this morning at 5:30. So it doesn't feels like I've had a day and now I've had another day, but it's actually a glorious trip on the train. And this is my first time in this part of North York. So I always go through Yorkshire on the train to various places, but I rarely stop and travel out. So thank you so much for having me here today. The other thing I would say before I get started on presenting on contextual safeguarding is that this is very much an approach. It's not a practice model. So we tend to talk about contextual safeguarding to say, take it away and think about how that might relate to the work that you already do. How might that strengthen or help you frame or communicate what you already do? It's not something that you take in place of something else. So I'm very much sharing what I have to say with you in the spirit of that, in the sense that you will take away and make of this what you think is going to be helpful. In that regard, I have to say North Yorks is one of the few places where we kind of Twitter search a lot on contextual safeguarding just to see who's saying it. Are they saying it in the right way? Have they really understood it? Or do they think it's something else? And we saw a tweet from North Yorks about the contextual safeguarding documents. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Go on, let me have a look. And it was one of the few times where I read a document in a site on contextual safeguarding and we'd had no contact with that site at all. And everything was completely accurate. And I was like, oh, well, we're clearly putting the right things on our network, because it is possible to completely understand this without speaking to us at all. So thank you for the work that you've already done to do thinking about what this would mean in your locality. And hopefully this will just add to that ongoing conversation. What I wanted to do was to kind of break down the session for you in a few ways. The first is to give you a kind of very brief look back at where we started when we were thinking about contextual safeguarding in 2011 to 2015, when the term was first being developed and thought about and why it was introduced. Really thinking about what the research evidence base has told us for a number of decades on adolescent development, which you'll all be very familiar with, and particularly what research was increasingly suggesting about the nature of risks outside of family homes, and what particularly serious case reviews and internal case reviewing that we were conducting was telling us about the needs of children and families who are being impacted by that issue. And it's important to understand those two dynamics, because contextual safeguarding really seeks to come in at an intersection between those two and think, how do we resolve a mismatch between the dynamics of adolescence and extra-familial harm that we're seeing emerging case review work and the response that child protection systems have historically offered to young people and to their families when they're affected by those issues. Having presented that and the contextual safeguarding framework that emerged, I'll then share with you some learning that happened out of our first series of testing, both in Hackney but also on our practice network. So we have about 6,500 members on our practice network from local authorities across the country who are feeding back to us the lessons that they are learning when they're trying to implement contextual safeguarding approaches in their practice, and then share with you what we hope to be doing looking forward and what that might mean for people here. So in terms of understanding contextual safeguarding, as I mentioned, there are key things that we always hold in mind. And the first is to recognise the developmental stage of the young people that we are thinking about. Contextual safeguarding is predominantly concerned with how we safeguard young people during adolescence. And when I talk about adolescence, I'm really thinking relatively broad, so from the age of 10, so last year of primary, moving into secondary education right through to 25. So what's happening in that time in someone's life that is important when we think about safeguarding? And there are four key things that we tend to reflect on continuously as we develop contextual safeguarding. The first is the kind of response that we have to risk during adolescence, and the fact that we will be responding to risk quite differently at this stage in our life to when we are an older, jaded person who believes in failure much more readily and is less likely to take a chance. So why is it that this is a time in your life where you're willing to take chances, and how do we maximise and work with that as an opportunity? The fact that this is pretty much a time in your life where you're motivated by the weekend. You know, Monday you care about Friday, Friday you care about Sunday, Sunday you care about the following Saturday. How do we engage with that in a system that requires you to always think about the 5-year plan and the 10-year consequences of your decisions? How do we see this as an opportunity? And the impact of puberty and the fact that you're emotionally all over the place. You know, you've fallen in love with this person and no one's ever known a love like it. No one ever will know a love like it again. No one's been in love apart from you. And then 2 weeks later, you hate that person and you're never speaking to them again, and your life is over and you're really angry and everyone's telling you to calm down because you're overreacting, and that makes you even more angry and it's overwhelming, and you don't really understand these experiences or these emotions, and often experiencing them for the first time, and all at a time in your life where you're basically an adult and you're ready to make some decisions for yourself and you don't need everybody else telling you what to do, and you have this increasing desire for self-autonomy and control. And really, we in the contextual safeguarding team at the university and with the sites we work with would very much see this as opportunities. You know, this is an age at which you believe in yourself, you know, you're willing to take chances, you're not jaded by failure, you can be motivated by a quick win, you don't always have to know what's in it in the long term for me to want to participate in this, where you are feeling really passionate about the things and the people that matter to you, and when you want to take some responsibility for yourself and you want some ownership of your life. So in many respects, that's a great opportunity, and I've just spent some time with colleagues from No Wrong Door, so I can clearly see that here, that is recognised. The challenge that we found when we've looked, particularly when we've spoken to young people and families affected by exploitation and other forms of harm beyond the family, and when we've reviewed cases, is that statutory services have, in some localities, responded to these dynamics of adolescence as a complete nightmare. And therefore, the problem with safeguarding adolescents is adolescence, because what they are looking for is someone who's not going to take any risks, understands the long-term consequences of their decisions, is emotionally stable and does as they're told. And the moment they encounter an adolescent who isn't any of those things, the problem then becomes the adolescent. Their risk-taking behaviour, their poor decision-making, they're all over the place, their anger, their aggression, their lashing out, them not listening to instructions, them going against our advice. All of these things are what's creating the risk. And therefore, all of our attempts at working with the risk is to fix them and to fix these dynamics of adolescence so they don't compromise our plan. The other issue for us in relation to extra-familial forms of abuse is that these dynamics of adolescence are an absolute dream for anyone that wants to exploit a child. Because you just give them a sense of risk, you offer them a short-term gain, bottle of vodka, ride in a car, 20 quid, whatever it is, acknowledge their emotions as authentic when everyone else is minimising them and playing on them. Yes, I am your partner. No one could understand the love we have. No one ever would understand the love we have. I am your best friend. I'm more loyal to you than your parents. No one would ever get it. You know, we get one another. No one else could understand you like me. And encourage them to make decisions that go against the advice of all the adults around them who care about them. They're trying to control you. I would never try to control you. They think you're a child. I know you're not a child. You're older than everyone else around you, you're more like an adult. And then it's really easy to manipulate a young person and to exploit them very quickly if you work well with the dynamics of adolescence. And those that groom young people do work very well with the dynamics of adolescence. And historically, that has been an increasing challenge for us because we've been working in services that fight against the dynamics of adolescence. And in that battle, all too often, those who exploit children will win, because they are playing the game and we are busy trying to fit young people into a service offer and a wider kind of culture and attitude about behaviour that doesn't fit their needs. So contextual safeguarding is fundamentally working on the basis that this is an opportunity. We need to work with adolescents to see these dynamics of development as an opportunity, and we need to be better at doing that than those that groom and exploit children. However, we know that most of our adolescents are safe and fine. So it's not enough to just say, oh, it's because they're going through these issues, that's why they're being exploited. No, because most young people will go through those issues and not be exploited. So what we also have to do is to think about adolescence in particular contexts. And the international research has been quite clear on this for over 2 decades, that there are certain contexts in which the dynamics of adolescence can be exploited, in which you can gain access to a young person, groom and harm them. Now, in relation to family contexts, there are the same kind of findings that we know to be true for a number of different forms of harm. Young people living with domestic abuse during adolescence and with previous exposure to domestic abuse are disproportionately featured in statistics around young people who are being exploited or being harmed outside of the home, and young people who are perpetrating that harm, and often they are the same young people. Young people co-offending with older siblings or being victimised alongside their older siblings. Wider experiences of neglect featuring in the backgrounds of some of these young people, and we are getting increasingly called into international schools to do work with them on contextual safeguarding, a number of whom charge up to £30,000 a year for a school place, who are grappling with cases of affluent neglect and parents not being emotionally available to their children, despite those children being raised in very financially privileged and secure settings. So we are definitely encountering neglect in quite a broad way in our work on contextual safeguarding. But the thing that comes up most in case file review, and the thing that tends to emerge most in research into exploitation that focuses on families, is families talking about a loss of control of their children, saying, oh, they used to pick up the phone, now they don't pick up the phone. They used to come home when they were told, now they don't. I don't know who they're talking to. I don't know where the money's coming from. They're stealing from me. They're smashing up the house. I've got younger children. I don't know how to handle this situation. And responses historically focusing on what that parent is or isn't doing right to regain control of that child. So what is the capacity of that parent? Is it that they have a substance misuse issue? Is it that they're in an abusive relationship? Is it that they have a mental health need? Is it that they're working 4 jobs? What is the reason that they've lost control of that child? And then we'll put a plan around that issue, and then they will regain control of that child, often supported through parenting courses and parenting classes. And case review after case review after case review have demonstrated the limitations of that type of approach, and primarily because in cases of extra-familial harm, often the pull factors that overwhelm parents are beyond their front door. So even when families have these issues, there are additional factors beyond the family once the exploitation has set in that require attention, and there'll be a number of families affected by these issues who don't have anything else going on in the family home, and the child is still being exploited. And no context is more significant in that regard than friends. Young people in the UK will experience an increase in peer influence during adolescence. That's not a global trend, which is why it wasn't on the adolescence slide. There are lots of countries around the world where peers don't increase in influence during adolescence, and parents remain the most dominant kind of context at setting social norms throughout human development. So the countries where we see peers increase in influence are the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Where we don't see it, India, Singapore, most African countries apart from South Africa, and France. Which is a whole other 2 hours. But it's worth noting 2 things. One is that when we support young people in the UK, the dominant pattern is that their peers become more important to them during adolescence than they have been before, and can outweigh the influence of their parents. For most parents, that's going to be a debate about footwear and music. So my husband is spending a long time at the moment playing our 2-year-old lots of jazz. I've told him he's going to hit 11 and he's going to reject Miles Davis outright, and he's going to find some music that makes your ears bleed and play it as loud as he possibly can for a solid 12, 13, 14 years. And you're going to think you've completely wasted your time, and you're going to be really upset about this. And then he's going to age out of just wanting to listen to that, and he'll probably rediscover jazz and act like he found it all by himself and that you had nothing to do with it at all, and probably come home and start playing you something and you think, I played you that when you were 4. That's what's going to happen, because for most parents, they will experience a drift, and young people return to the norms that were instilled in them in early childhood, intermingled with those they develop during adolescence, and they go on to have their own families, find employment, and there's not been an issue because peers increased in influence. For me, it was an outright rejection of Clark's footwear once I moved to secondary school, and now most of my shoes are from Clark's. So we see that pattern happening quite a lot. However, if we are working with young people whose parents do not have this experience, it's difficult for any parent to feel like you're losing your child and you were the centre of their world, and now all of a sudden this other person who's actually quite annoying to you is more important in some respects than you are, and that can be quite hurtful. For a parent who has never experienced this, their friends were determined by their parents and they only had a couple of them. This is a very strange experience, and this isn't about there being a right way or a wrong way. I have no position on whether it's better to be in a country where peers increase in influence or not. The fact is that in some countries they do, and in some countries they don't. And if we need to think about how we support parents who do not have experience of this happening when it happens with their young people, particularly if that intersects with other difficulties that are going on in or around the family home. So my husband will say that when he was growing up, he was never allowed to go to sleepovers. Absolutely not. His parents were like, who are all these people? No, we don't want them in and out of our house. Your friends are the children of our friends, and that is it. We don't want all of these random people in and out of our house. That was their cultural expectation, which for him was absolutely fine because he's massively antisocial and didn't really want many friends anyway. For some of his siblings, that was a bit more of a stressor. So it's really important to understand these dynamics when we're supporting young people. When it comes to supporting young people impacted by extra-familial harm, this is even more important because the research is quite clear that peer relationships are correlated with young people's experiences of harm outside of the family home in all its forms. So Christine Barter's work into intimate partner violence during adolescence, for example, found that for young men in the UK, they were more likely to report being part of a violent or aggressive peer group when they were abusing their partners than they were to be living in a violent family. In fact, peer violence was the only significant correlating factor to their own use of violence towards partners. For young women, family violence was more significantly correlated to their own use of violence towards partners. But for young men, peer violence was a real concern. We also know that young people commit offences in groups that they don't commit on their own. And that applies to a range of offences, from antisocial behaviour, weapon use, drug taking, drug dealing, climbing on buildings, setting fires, sexual offences, attempted murder. There will be young people involved in those incidents who, if they were on their own on that day, would never have been involved in an incident. They wouldn't have stabbed anyone, they wouldn't have sexually assaulted anyone, they wouldn't have robbed anyone. So for us to try and then assess the needs of a young person, the risk they pose to others, the risk they pose to themselves, their protective factors, without any reference to who their friends are, is quite short-sighted, because actually a child can escalate to quite a serious situation based solely on who their friends are. And if we haven't factored that in, then we may miss an opportunity to offer support earlier, or to identify that there are some protective factors in their friendship groups when they're living in difficult family circumstances, and their friends can be the thing that carries them through adolescence despite what's going on at home. So we have to understand young people's friendships if we want to understand how we safeguard them during adolescence, and that also applies to things like disclosure, because we know young people will disclose to peers often before adults, and the reaction that peers give to a disclosure can then determine what happens next in terms of help seeking. But to understand the dynamics of those friendships, we have to understand the context in which those friendships are forming. Have they formed in school environments? And if they have formed in school environments, what are those environments like? If young people are forming friendships in educational settings where they are effective responses in place to issues like bullying, problematic corridor culture, particularly the lifting of skirts, pinging of bra straps as young people transition between lessons, school environments that are being targeted for the purpose of recruitment into organised criminal activity or drug distribution. If these things can be responded to effectively, then young people are forming friendships in environments where they think that adults can offer them support and will, and that they don't have to handle these things on their own. If young people are forming friendships in school environments where these issues are unaddressed, normalised or ignored, then young people lean on their friends for protection and for answers to why these things are happening. And we have seen that time and time again when we've reviewed cases, for example, of sexual assaults on school premises, where young people's friends have sought support from staff. That support has been ineffective and it has normalised what has then escalated to a very serious sexual assault, for example. Or we visited schools where young women have been advised to wear shorts under their skirts, so when the boys lift them up, their underwear won't be exposed. That type of policy, hugely problematic for normalising harmful sexual behaviour, and the young people in those settings then, again, normalising harmful sexual behaviour. And some things quite unintended. So in relation to the curriculum, we're just wrapping up a study with 14 schools looking at how they're dealing with peer-to-peer abuse within a school setting, and part of that has been involving interviewing young people about their experiences, and we're learning two key things. The first is around the curriculum, asking young people about image sharing, which we've seen linked to self-harm during adolescence, attempts at suicide, and wider forms of social isolation. Young people saying if they saw a sexual image of another young person that had been shared around the school, they would blame the person in the image for that having been shared about them, not the person who onward shared it. And when we've asked young people why they're blaming the person in the image who has been victimised in the scenario, they'll say because we've all been in the same lessons, we've all been told A, taking a photo of yourself is illegal, and B, if you share it, it's going to get shared around, so don't share it. They were in the same lessons that we were in, they were told to not share it and they did, therefore it's their fault. Completely missing the point of the risks posed by onward sharing, and then creating a culture in that school where they're blaming victims. Where if this happens to you, it's your fault because you shared the image in the first place. I wouldn't tell a teacher if that happened to me because I'd get in trouble. I'd get in trouble with my parents, so I'm going to keep it all to myself. And that creates a school culture in which people have carte blanche to do what they want because nobody's telling anybody when it is happening. Now, that is an unintended consequence of a message in the curriculum that is meant to be protective rather than a message that is explicitly victim blaming. We're also seeing similar message from young people about zero tolerance approaches to harmful sexual behaviour in the school. Policies about we will exclude if this happens. Young people saying, well, no one tells the teachers anything in this school because if you tell them they're going to get excluded, and I don't want them to get excluded. I want something to happen, but I don't want them to get excluded. And the school's thinking it's really effective because they're not getting any complaints. But they're not getting any complaints because the policy is pushing young people away from seeking help. So thinking about what are the dynamics in these school environments, how are they informing young people's peer relationships and their own decision making is really important for how we understand protection. And the same applies in neighbourhood settings. Young people's exposure to street-based victimisation, grooming, robbery is really important to understand. The crime survey suggests young people experiencing about 460,000 incidents of violent crime in any 1 year. Over 70% of that perpetrated by other young people, mostly mobile phone theft, bicycle theft, clothing theft, with a threat of violence or threat of weapon use. These experiences often early on as they start to travel to school alone, start to go to the park on their own, start to go to shopping centres on their own, informing their sense of safety in the community. Who can they go to stop that from happening a second time? Who are the trusted adults around them? Is it the police? Is it youth workers? Is it the bus driver? Is it the person that works at the takeaway shop? Or is it their friends? Or is it another adult that steps in and offers help who actually isn't protective at all? And young people's really early experiences of victimisation informing later their own use of harm towards others. We also know where the access points are for criminal and sexual exploitation of young people. Private children's homes being one of them, but we also know that young people spend their time at different places and spaces at about 3:30 every day. Sometimes it's outside a fast food takeaway shop that's giving them free Wi-Fi. Sometimes it's in a park. Sometimes it's in a bus terminus or train station, particularly those that are blaring classical music in the hope that young people will just board the transport and not hang around, and they don't. They hang around because they're catching up with their friends. All of these places and spaces where young people are. Does anyone have their eyes out for the welfare of young people in those places? Because if they don't, they're very easy access points. You just keep offering someone a bag of chips or a bag of weed and see which one says yes. And nobody's looking out at who is this random adult talking to all of these young people. So thinking about how we build guardianship in the settings where our young people congregate, not surveillance, but guardianship, and supporting them is really important if we want an effective response to early intervention and prevention. And we also know that young people's experiences of sexual harm often happens in public places during adolescence, as well as private dwellings during house parties. So young people will talk about stairwells, disused garages, disused alleys, parks behind bushes, toilets in shopping centres, backs of cars, certain places where harm regularly occurs. They can generally point those out on a map of a local area or on a route that they may take to get to meet up with friends. Have we adopted a normalisation of those places as places where that thing happens in our work? How do we respond? Do we suggest that young people just stop going there? Or do we feel like we can actually affect change there? And in one of the cases I reviewed at the very start of this work, a young woman was raped on a stairwell, and everyone involved in that rape received a custodial sentence, and there were 6 young people involved in that assault. 2 young women who gave evidence for the prosecution were moved away. She was moved away. A young man who helped her was moved away, and the stairwell remained a hotspot for another 6 years. Well, why is it happening there? Why do we tolerate that? That suggests that it will always happen there. So I've got to navigate that, rather than it shouldn't be happening there and we can do something about it. So we know that adolescent vulnerability is highly contextual, and that these contexts impact each other all the time and play out both online and offline. Young people routinely ask me to not put an online circle around these circles, because it's not a separate world to them. It's part of their friendship group, school and community. It is a public place, the same as the bus stop. So we always think about the online and offline intersecting in these ways. And so the research is calling on us to say, okay, if we want to address exploitation that's occurring outside of families, we know sometimes families are involved in exploitation. If we want to address serious youth violence, risks of radicalisation, abuse in young people's first romantic relationships, bullying and social isolation, if we want to address these issues, we have to be able to engage with young people's peer relationships and understand the impact of peer influence. We have to understand the process of grooming, how it starts, how it happens, that it's not linear, and the impact that it has on young people's decision making. We have to be willing to work alongside young people, and I know that's something you do very well here, building on that sense of agency that they have during adolescence, so that they are partners in their plans and their support offers. We have to be able to offer them something that's counteracting whatever they think they're getting out of this, or whatever they might be getting out of this. And that doesn't mean us giving them a bottle of vodka instead of the people that are harming them, but we do need to have a way to think about what it is that vodka gives them and how do we deal with that. And for young people who are experiencing criminal exploitation, we also have to think about how we're going to mitigate the risks of debt. And if you are identifying young people in your area who are being criminally exploited, including young people who might have been moved here, this is an increasing concern for them. The fact that they owe money, and that poses a risk not just to them, but their family and friends, and local authorities being caught off guard when they are being asked the question, I owe £2,000, what are you going to do? Because it's an ethically murky area to get into, but that's not good enough in terms of us being like, oh, we don't really know. We have to have some difficult conversations about what it is we do. Even if it is on a case-by-case basis, what are the potential options here? Because that helps us think about the interconnected dynamics of exploitation, whether it's sexual, criminal, peer-to-peer. We will have to engage with the power at play, the consent decisions that are being made, and the exchanges that are happening in these abusive relationships. And how then all of these 5 factors inform those, and how wider socioeconomic factors like poverty, racism, sexism are impacting young people and playing out in the context in which they spend their time. But that is a big ask. And because it is a big ask, we often go into local areas and sit around hearing issues about threshold. Lots and lots and lots of debate about, I tried to refer this child into children's services and I was told it hadn't reached a threshold for ongoing work. Or we're not going to talk about thresholds anymore because that's confusing things. We're just not sure that this child meets our needs, or we can meet their needs, I should say. And when we dig deep into some of those cases, those knotty cases that seem to be challenging local areas, there are a few things that seem to be going on. For some, it's because the child is 17 and a half. And so no one's saying they're not vulnerable, but there's a lot of questions about, well, what could a social care offer be in 6 months? How would we make that work? They're about to age out and they don't reach a threshold for adult services. And that lack of transition is really what is frustrating practitioners. Often, however, it's because the risk that presents significant harm is sitting outside of the family home, not within the family home, and people are not sure, therefore, what they can do about that. So some of these young people might sit in early help services for a long time and then overnight need an emergency placement because they've escalated outside of the home, even though the family's remained stable and is engaging positively in work. Sometimes it's because there is issues in the family and the plan is focusing on the issues in the family, but that's not getting rid of the drug debt. That's not getting rid of the sexual exploitation that's happening at school. It doesn't deal with any of those things. And so that still remains a thorny issue for the young person. Sometimes because the young person is being abused by another young person and not by an adult. We have seen far better responses to adult-perpetrated sexual exploitation in particular, but when it's peer-to-peer, things tend to fall apart. It's not so easy to disrupt a child who is instigating harm as it is to disrupt an adult. If they're all in college together, they're all in school together, they see each other all the time. It's not an adult spending time with another child, and sometimes the person who is accused is younger than the person they're meant to be harming. It gets very difficult, particularly when there's not going to be a criminal justice response, and for a number of these cases there won't be. And so when the police stop, everything can stop, even though people are anxious. And sometimes it's because there isn't an individual child who is escalating. It's a situation or a space that's escalating. So one child experiences something in a school or at a bus stop or on the high street, and then a week later another child experiences something, and then 2 weeks later another child experiences something. And none of those children on their own are escalating, but the context is escalating, or the group is escalating. And that's missed because we're not focusing on context or groups, we're focusing on individual children. And so despite practitioners being very concerned, in a number of local areas the system has deprioritised these cases historically. People are very worried. You know, I don't really go into local authorities where practitioners are not worried. They are frustrated with the levers and mechanisms that they're trying to work with to respond to these contextual dynamics of harm. So before we ever do any contextual safeguarding work in an area, we learnt a little bit late in the day that the first thing we had to do is understand the culture in a service and how they situate extra-familial harm and the children impacted by it. If we don't understand that, it's quite difficult to work out what contextual safeguarding would look like in a local area. And one of the ways that we do that is we sample cases to look at decision-making, to look at the language in decision-making, but also the pathways for young people and what's available for them. So what I thought would be helpful to do is if you could just take up to 10 minutes on your table, see how long you need, to think about 4 children. And these are, I apologise in advance, quite crude splits. People's lives are messier than this, but it is a helpful way of sense checking how you think your service engages with different levels of need. So in terms of a young person coming into children and family services here, if we have child A, this is a child who's at risk of significant harm in an external setting, in a community setting. Say they have been stabbed or they have been sexually assaulted by a peer. This has already happened and we know it's happened. And there are significant concerns about what's going on at home as well. Domestic abuse happening right now, for example. That's child A. Difficulties outside of the home, difficulties inside of the home. Versus child B, who's got some emerging needs outside of the home. Maybe they've been found in possession of drugs. Maybe they've been found in possession of a weapon. Maybe they're best friends with someone who we know is being sexually exploited. So we've got some initial concerns about them. And there are also significant problems at home. Maybe domestic abuse happening again, for example. Versus child C, who, like child A, is experiencing significant harm in their community. They have been stabbed, they have been sexually assaulted. But unlike child A, there's no concerns about anything at home. So the parents are taking appropriate steps to safeguard the child. There's appropriate care, there's appropriate concern. And child D, who, like child B, has got some emerging needs outside of the home. There's a suggestion that things might be going wrong, but there's no significant harm yet. But there are no concerns about anything in the family home. What are the pathways for these children? What might be some of the considerations that are being made when they first present at Children and Family Services and as they work through? Where may they end up? Are they going to have a social worker working with them? Would they sit in an early help service? Do you have an active youth service? Where may they float to, and what might be the different offers for those young people? have a conversation for about 10 minutes, and then we'll reflect back on that before we think about what that would mean for contextual safeguarding. I just get a sense from the room, what were some of the things you were thinking through on your table, and were there any disagreements? Did everyone find it quite clear, or what were some of the things you were talking through? Anyone want to start?
How complex it all is.
Absolutely.
Regardless of which category you want to come into, there are so many variables. There's issues of consent, there's issues around learning difficulties.
Yeah.
It's just there's a myriad of variables that you would have to look at.
Yeah, yeah.
Be able to come up with a plan and a decision.
Yeah, yeah, yes.
Actually, it's everybody's responsibility. So it isn't, that needs to come straight into safeguarding. Each area of professions that are out there to come together to try to disrupt, and I think that's where it becomes really problematic. Yeah. Working out whose responsibility it is and how it can be a collective responsibility rather than a single agency responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? Yeah?
I think some of we constantly, and not just really today and on this table, we're having the conversation around the child protection system and where that really fits with contextual safeguarding.
Yeah.
And that is really complex, and how we can only work that by actually really not having any blankets around it and really looking at it in terms of individual cases.
Yeah.
We said we can't just say no to there not being a child protection plan because of contextual safeguarding.
Yeah.
Because it's a case-by-case basis. And often there's a number of other agencies that have really heightened anxieties and feel like there needs to be a formal arrangement in place to manage some of that risk.
Yeah.
I think the categories help.
They don't. No, the categories don't really help this. Yeah.
I mean, most people know I'm quite passionate about the loss of a lot of our youth services, our youth work, and where we had a contextual community presence, where we were present, we were focused on engaging with young people and families in communities, developing relationships, taking a social action approach to some of these problems, alongside the other disruptive factors.
Yeah.
And some of what we did was disruptive in its very nature.
Yeah.
And I think we're missing that now, and we're really seeing the impact of a loss of that over the last few years. A lot of my early years practice background was street-based detached youth work, hanging out in the stairwell, looking for safety, and creating social action approaches that develop young people, give them the resilience, the skills to be able to make those decisions, to make those different choices. And I think a lot of that's missing now. And for me, that's where we need to be focused.
Yeah. Thank you. Really helpful contributions. Anyone else? And I'll bite my hand off.
I think we were saying that, we would take every one of those situations. We only got to A and B.
Yeah.
Exactly the same. We'd be curious, we'd be looking at bringing the multi-agencies in, if that's with family agreement or depending on the threshold. But we've still got a long way to go thinking about contextual safeguarding not being an add-on, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
We're being more curious, we're looking wider, we're working out what we can do on an individual basis.
Yeah, and these are all, really positive contributions, and I would say just reflects what we were talking about when we were thinking about no wrong door and the wider practice culture it sits in before I came to present to you, because when we have this discussion in local areas, we get very, very different responses. Everywhere we go, there's a different conversation happening. All of it around complexity, all of it asking about, well, what is the child protection system for and how do we work with that? But then different approaches to, do we work around it? Do we reshape it ourselves? Do we follow what we think it is? Kind of what's leadership saying around that? That tends to emerge quite differently. So in some localities, they will be very clear that child A would receive a different response to child B, would receive it, and they can kind of quite clearly say that because they're following what they think is required. Not, well, we'd have to think about this and we'd have to think about that. That's not necessarily the approach they're taking. So it's really important to note that that is your position and reflecting on, well, what would that mean for you in terms of contextual safeguarding? And I'll revisit that as I work through now the contextual safeguarding framework. But the reason why I flag it is because one of the fundamental debates we get into with local authorities who want to think about adopting a contextual safeguarding approach is understanding how does the current Children and Family Service and the wider partnership understand the role of the child protection system when it comes to harm beyond families. What is its position? Is its position that social workers are involved around parenting and police deal with disruption? And you'll be surprised the number of areas where that is the position, even though people think it's not. Once you look in the case files, that is the position. Or where people think, no, we look at the level of harm the child's experiencing and the needs that the child has and the family has, and that's what drives our decision making. What's needed here, not where is the need located. But that's not a straightforward path to follow, and it is really important to continually interrogate that, because that will shape what contextual safeguarding looks like in a local area. So, in terms of what contextual safeguarding is, in response to thinking about some of those, in essence, contextual safeguarding is just this slide. That's it, but there'll be a lot of slides that follow that kind of break that down. When we proposed contextual safeguarding as a concept, what we were saying was safeguarding systems and partnerships needed to be able to achieve four things if they wanted to resolve some of the historic tensions that have kind of emerged in case review around how services have responded to extra-familial risks and harms. The first is the system needed to be able to target the context in which the abuse was occurring and the social conditions in which that abuse happened, not just target the individuals being affected by the abuse at any one given time. And that might sound quite obvious, but actually when you look back at cases, what we've done is target children. We've put them on healthy relationships courses, we've kind of given them anger management courses, we've done whatever we can to try to fix them, and then we've looked at the parents getting more control over that. We've not targeted the environments in which the abuse is occurring so readily if that abuse is not related within the family setting. So it's really important to think, well, if the abuse has happened in school or in this friendship group or in the park, what are we doing about that? Or have we just assumed this is about those kids? It's not about the park or the school. How do we know that? Unless we've really engaged with it from the point at which we've received the referral and we're starting to think about what's needed. Then, how do we do it? What's the framing? And once again, some of these risks have been thought of solely as a community safety issue. We see that particularly around serious youth violence. That's a community safety issue. Gangs is a community safety issue. And we'll deal with the safeguarding stuff. Now, extra-familial harm does require a lens of safeguarding. Doesn't mean that police and community safety aren't essential partners. They are. But the system can't be driven through a crime measure. And historically, in a number of cases around CSC, success was delivered by criminal justice outcomes. So did we have a trial? Did we disrupt with a policing action? That is only part of the process. And as your colleague was mentioning, a lot of the disruption really should be socially and welfare based. Do we have options around that? Are we only working with these extra-familial factors through the lens of community safety and then supporting children and families, or do we have a welfare offer into friendship groups, schools and public spaces where we have a concern about the welfare of children and young people? Just as we might be supporting families on child protection plans or child in need plans where there's no criminal investigation, so too should we be able to support friendship groups or public places where there are concerns but no criminal investigation. We can't wed our safeguarding response to crime investigations in relation to extra-familial harm. But in order to do that, we do require very strong partnerships with a really broad range of people. This can't be about social care, health and police. This has to be about a range of partners, some of whom have included waste management services, residents associations, security industry association, leisure, sports, parks and recreation. Who are the people who have a reach into the places and spaces where the harm is occurring? Are they thought of as safeguarding partners? Not just information sharing agents, actual safeguarding partners. What could they bring to the table? with some of this work, and what do we not have anymore? And in some areas where they are progressing with contextual safeguarding, they have reinvested in detached youth work, which they should never have decommissioned in the first place, to re-engage with some of that. But there are now massive skill set issues and also wider questions about community development as an additional factor in some of that. But these are really important questions to be asking ourselves. And I saw a really interesting partnership when I visited Australia a couple of years ago between forensic psychologists and rubbish collectors. The forensic psychologists had 6 referrals for young people who were convicted of sexual offences. They adopted a contextual approach to assessment, so as part of the assessment they visited the locations where the assaults had happened, which were parks. Parks that ran off the backs of houses, lots of parks. They had to understand those places to understand the child, understand the assessment, so that's what they did. They made routine visits to the parks, and as part of that process identified that the only people really using those spaces were the young people and rubbish collectors who went in and cleared the rubbish regularly. So started to talk to them about the challenges they were facing. The community had said to them, this is the tip of the iceberg, what you're dealing with. This problem is entrenched. We don't know what to do. We're afraid. And so now the rubbish collectors email the forensic psychologists every morning an account of the rubbish they've collected in all the parks that run off the backs of the houses around that part of Queensland. They tell them where they've collected evidence of alcohol use, drug use and sex happening, so they can target that outreach offer into the parks where there are concerns. There's no additional deployment of police, there's no additional surveillance on young people. They are the people who were already there. So they were engaged to think, well, what could your safeguarding role be? This is our problem. What do you think you could offer? And they came up with that offer themselves. And that's built an increased sense of guardianship in and around the park. And there are actually really now emerging good relationships between the rubbish collectors and the residents who were kind of peeking through their windows at what were going on but felt too afraid to engage in a conversation about it. So who are these key partners in our place in the spaces, and do we recognise the contribution that they could make? And how do we measure our success? How do we know that our system is having the outcomes that young people and families need and want? When it comes to forms of exploitation, serious youth violence, we often measure success very individually. Missing episodes, truancy, training. We kind of go through all of these things that were happening before we got involved and now aren't happening since we've been involved or whatever, as a way of measuring our effectiveness. But how do we actually know that that means anyone's safer? Do we really know? Have we interrogated it enough? We know that children who go missing overnight may stop going missing overnight and start going missing during the day because they've been reported missing overnight, and so people start to move them about during the day instead. We know that some of our young people who are on part-time timetables in education aren't formally missing because they're not meant to be anywhere. But just because they're not missing, it doesn't mean they're any safer. And once they slip into a statistic, all we know is that they were missing and now they're not. But actually, all it is that they were in full-time education and now they're not. And that's why they're no longer missing, but they're actually still being exploited. When we work with 15 young people and we're effective with them, how do we not know that we've just created a vacuum that another 15 have filled? So all we've done is created churn in the process of exploitation. We've safeguarded 15, another 15 have slipped in. Safeguarded those 15, another 15 have slipped in. Have we disrupted the actual source? Is the context where the abuse was happening safer? Or have we just changed the children who are being abused within it? How do we know? Do we know the number of areas in our community where young people feel safe and the number of areas where they feel unsafe? Do we have ambitions around increasing the number of areas where they feel safe? Do we understand why they feel safe in those areas? Or do we understand what would mean we felt they felt safe in those areas? We see a lot of concerns when we visit local areas about McDonald's. And I'm not here to say anything about McDonald's, particularly because I'm being filmed. But what I would say is when we talk to young people, they often say they feel safe in McDonald's because there are other adults there with younger children and it's a well-lit space. So everyone's very anxious because the crime stats are showing it's a hotspot. Young people are congregating there for reasons that they hold. If we don't understand that, we see the policy of, let's just switch off the Wi-Fi. We need to just switch off that Wi-Fi, and then they'll move a bit down the road. And then we don't know where they've gone, and actually we've moved them to somewhere where they feel less safe, and we've not understood what's happening at all. So how do we understand safety? How do we measure our success in our system? Is it contextualised? Do we understand the context in which the harm is happening? Do we understand the context in which we're seeing behaviour change? How are we reflecting that back to senior leaders, to commissioners, to each other? There was one young person whose case I reviewed where he was truanting from school, and he was late every day. He was late into lessons. He was using the toilet during classes instead of at break time, and the school had been using sanctions to try to keep him in, and those sanctions were ineffective. So then children's services were contacted about what was going on, and it turned out he had a sibling with a disability, and it was believed that maybe things had got a bit chaotic at home, and if we put in some more support into the family, he'll be able to concentrate more in school and he'll arrive to school on time. The family said they didn't really think that was an issue. They thought things were going okay. He went along with the narrative of what social workers and the school were saying, and so support went into the family. Nothing changed at school. There was then a threat to fine the family for him not getting into school on time, and within a week and a half he came into school on time. And he came in every day on time, and he came into lessons on time, and he stayed in lessons. So on the face of it, the effective intervention was the threat to fine, because that's what made the truancy drop, and the success measure was truancy. In or out, that's why we're worried. Later that year, I was called in to review his case because he later disclosed that he'd been sexually and physically assaulted by a group of young people, a number of whom were in school with him, although the assault happened in the community. This happened after his truancy went down. It then turned out he'd been coming in late every day because he waited for everybody to be in classrooms before he came into the school building. And then he waited for teachers to be in classrooms before he went into them. And then he used the toilets during lesson time rather than at the break time, because if he used the toilet in the break time, he was assaulted in the toilets. So the moment his truancy went down, his risk went up. And there was no space to properly explore that with him. A, because people went straight to, if there's something going on at school, there's got to be something going on in the family. And he followed that path because he didn't want to say anything. He just went with every excuse that was given. There was not enough curiosity about what could be going on, and no understanding that actually the truancy could be his protective behaviour. That's the thing that was making him safer. So we had to be far more curious in his case, but also identify that actually the school was not a safe place for him to be. And that's what he was doing when he was managing harm in that setting. So how do we think contextually about when we think we're doing the right things? So in essence, a contextual safeguarding system is one that can target the context in which abuse occurs and the social conditions in those contexts, do it through the lens of child welfare, bring in the appropriate partners to create safety in those contexts, and measure impact contextually. That is a contextual safeguarding system. Totally easy to do. So in terms of what that demands of a system, there's a few things. The first is that when people start to try to do this, what they're doing is looking at a collective capacity to safeguard young people, not just the parents' capacity. Of course, parental capacity remains a discussion, although I'd rather not use that term. What are the parents doing? What could happen better? What support is needed at home? But also what support is needed on the bus route? What support is needed on the high street? What support is needed in the school? What support is needed outside the youth club? Whose capacity is actually being compromised here? In one of our test sites, they're dealing with an issue where outside the open access youth service, children are being assaulted by other young people, and they can't create safety in and around the open access youth service. That is not the parents of those children whose capacity is being compromised because other young people are assaulting their children outside the youth club. But those young people are at risk, and one was very seriously hospitalised. So what are we going to do about it? Whose capacity has been compromised? Who can make a difference? And who is compromising that capacity. And that means that safeguarding being everybody's responsibility or everybody's business is about everybody creating safe spaces together. It's not about everybody making referrals to children's services, which is what it ends up being shorthand, is you will be alert to the signs of abuse and then you will phone us and then we'll go and visit the family and then we won't know what to do because we actually need you all on board to create safety for this young person. Because what we've done, we've trained taxi drivers, we've trained security staff, we've trained hoteliers. All these people have been trained to pick up the phone, not to build a plan around creating safety in the hotel or in the park or in the public space. And that's actually what we need from those partners. We also have to understand the significance that peer relationships pose to young people and work out how we build that into our practice. I built this map following a case review that I ran of a young person. This 11-year-old girl in the middle of this map, she disclosed being sexually abused by everyone running along the top of this map and down the side of it. They were all aged 13 to 15 years old. These 5 were all in school with her, and the plan to support her was to give her a 12-week healthy relationships programme, give her a mentor to manage her anger, change her school timetable so she wouldn't encounter the 5 boys at school with her because there was an ongoing police investigation, move her out of the area and then secure her for 6 months. None of which, as you would know, given your policy around relocation, safeguarded her. She internalised a lot of self-blame and said, well, it's clearly a problem with me because everyone's trying to fix me, was her words, everyone's trying to fix me when I'm telling you what's happening to me. But what was really stark to me about this particular case was nearly every single young person on this map had a professional in their life. A number of those young men were on child protection plans, some were on child in need plans, some were with early help, some were on out of court disposals, others were open to youth justice service for another matter, all were in education. Not a single plan was coordinated with another plan. So there was no plan for the group. There was so much money being spent on this group and no effect on the group at all. This young man at the top led nearly every assault. He was living in the most vulnerable family setting. Every time something happened at home, the whole group escalated. But this young person's worker doesn't understand why. Yesterday everything seemed fine and now today there's an allegation that he's assaulted someone in a toilet of a takeaway shop because they didn't know that something happened to this child. And managing that is really hard because of information sharing, GDPR, but we have to think about how we engage with this. If we know that young people's behaviour is influencing each other, how do we get on top of that? Because there was a hell of a lot of money spent on this group, a lot of professional anxiety around it, a lot of disclosures made by a lot of children, and very little safeguarding happened in the process. These young women became the new victims of the group once this young woman was moved away because they'd witnessed assaults, and a number of these young people are now in custody for attempted murder. So we didn't have a very good outcome in this case, even though ultimately 2 young people were convicted of sexual assaults. That didn't safeguard anybody. And the investigation took 2 years, during which time all of this was going on. So we had to really think about the friendships, and everything needed to do that was in the plan, but it wasn't coordinated in that way. So when people have started to think about how do we take this collective approach when we're thinking about capacity to safeguard, how do we create safe spaces, how do we build peer relationships into our work, there's a few things that start to emerge. The first thing we learnt within 6 months of our first test approach was that really you're trying to do things at 2 levels when you do contextual safeguarding. At one level, you're trying to embed context into everything you do with children and families. From the point of referral and identification all the way through, and obviously the system is not as linear as this. And the more that you do that, the more that you identify friendship groups, school environments, locations that require attention themselves. And then the system needs to be able to respond to those groups and places. And both of those things need to be able to happen. But the level 1 stuff is far more achievable within existing practice structures. So if we think about the level 1 stuff, a really basic change that happened quite quickly in a number of test areas was, okay, the child's been referred into Children's Services front door. Often we're recording the address of their home address, but not the location where they've been harmed. Then we start to profile need at the front door, and all we're profiling is where these children live. That's not necessarily where they're most vulnerable. So just thinking, have we got context in at the front door? When children experience harm as a group, Are they separated out immediately when they're referred in, or do we acknowledge that they're in a group? Sometimes they were coming in, 3 arrested together. Oh, one's already open. I'll let their social worker know. That person, okay, no, we'll offer them early help. That one's closed. The whole group information's lost. There's no action around the group. And then the child that was closed bounces back in 2 weeks later, still connected to that child that's open there. Really thinking about, have we captured the contextual dynamics at the moment the child comes into the service? How do we apply threshold then at the point of screening? And then when we think about assessment, how do we draw context in? And I'm going to talk a bit about that and follow that through in terms of planning. So when we're thinking about when we're assessing what a young person needs, constantly looking for opportunities to bring context into that work. We're seeing attempts to do a lot of mapping work with young people, printing off maps of local areas or school buildings or very specific locations, or pin dropping them on tablets or phones if young people prefer to do that, and giving them crayons or using the iPad to colour code maps, red, amber, green, where do you feel safe, unsafe, neutral. Young people are engaging quite well in that, even when they're not disclosing why they feel unsafe in a particular locality or why they feel safe. Obviously, trusted relationships are really important. Otherwise, we don't know that a young person trusts us to tell us where they feel safe or unsafe, may just tell us what they think we want them to say. But if we are doing that work and we're identifying a red space for a young person, their red space may be bang where we ask them to come and meet us every time, or in the location where the intervention is, or they may have to travel through a red zone to get to school, or whatever it is. Do you have any green people in your red zone? Could I help you find a green person? Do we have contacts in community? Are we engaging with local businesses where we haven't got concerns? Because obviously we know we have local businesses where we do have concerns. Do we know where we could go to find a green person for a young person who needs to get from A to B safely and they're travelling through a red zone to do it? Does that give us a step at a sense of trust? We worked with one voluntary sector organisation who was trialling this, and a young woman was truanting from school. She identified the route to school was a red zone for her. So the voluntary sector worker spoke to her, spoke to her sister, did a walk with her, a number of different ways to walk to school. And then with her consent, spoke to 2 shopkeepers who they knew they could trust, who were part of the community. They were part of the community, so they could work with partnerships to make that decision. With the consent of that young person, went in and said, if this young person feels anxious on their route to school, can they come into your shop? Not this is why, because actually we didn't even know why they felt anxious at the time. They agreed. So then when the young person left her house, her sister texted the Safer Schools officer that she'd gone, she walked her route, she knew her green people, she got to school, she let the schools officer know, he texted her sister. When she left, they did the same thing. Truancy declined within a couple of weeks. Now, we still don't know why that was a red zone, but what it did do was engender some trust and belief that professionals could offer some support, that they could listen, that they could plan alongside you, and kept that child with her and reduced the truancy in the process. It's really important to think about where are our opportunities to leverage our influence and try and support a young person, not just do the map for the assessment and then the plan that's exactly the same. What does the map tell us about what this young person needs? At the point at which the first call is made, do you know anything about your young person's friends? Do you know any of their parents? Do you have any concerns? Do you have any friends that you're really, you're spending a lot of time with, you get on with the parents? Really giving the parents the chance to talk about friends, to talk about places, seems to open up the conversation. And the more that we do that, the more we can identify contexts where harm might be occurring. So we might then start to identify friendship groups that are important to a young person. We've seen work with young people to map their friendship groups. Who are your friends? Not just so we know who you know, but where are the opportunities for support? So in this map that happened between a young person and a professional, saying, well, this is my best friend, I've known them since primary school, we used to live on the same estate, our parents know each other. That was a relationship professionals were really concerned about, but the mapping work suggested there's absolutely no point trying to disrupt that relationship. We have to work out how we're going to create some safety here. The parents know each other, maybe that's an opportunity to do some work with them together. Could we offer some positive activities to them? Could we take that risk rather than saying we don't want them together because this is a long-standing friendship and at the moment looks like it's going to continue? I've known this young person from football, I see them only at practices. Okay, but this seems to be a really positive friendship, so how could we nurture that? The football coach, could we get them on board? Could they help us think about that friendship a bit more? So using the map generated by the young person to start planning with them, as well as mapping the connections between cases where it's felt that is helpful. I'm working with this young person, you're working with that young person, you're working with that young person. What do they need as a group? And sometimes doing that through things like a peer assessment. And we've developed assessment triangles for peer groups, schools and neighbours to help people start thinking about what an assessment might be. Sometimes we observe meetings around groups, and what ends up happening is everyone's worker comes, and then each worker says something about their young person, and then everyone leaves with actions for their young person. But there's not really been a discussion about the group. And there can be a lot of anxiety about information sharing, and this person's overshared about that young person, and your young person's doing this to my young person. What we really need is a discussion about the dynamics of the group. So the triangle tries to facilitate that with some key headlines. Okay, we're going to sit down and talk about the dynamic of the group functioning, who leads, who follows, what's the positive, what's the negative elements of this friendship group. So what are the dynamics? What are the weak relationships? What are the strong ties? Do we know that? What's the guardianship capacity around the group? Who are the potential guardians of the group? Is it their parents? Do they know each other? Is it the youth worker they all trust? Is it the football coach? Is it the teacher? Is it one of us? Who is it that is a trusted adult for this friendship group? And where are they spending their time? What's the nature of the environment where they spend their time? Is there anything we could do about that environment? Do they need an alternative space? So you're not coming in to share information about that person's parent and that happened to that and a whole chronology about that child, because that's happened on their own plans. This is about the groups. It has to be about added value. What does this conversation about the friendship group add to what we've already got in place for these young people? And is that making the best use of our resource? And that may require support from leaders in terms of the policies that might need to be in place to support that type of information sharing and working, and helping practitioners to think about how you elevate a conversation from being about groups, from being about individuals to being about groups, because that is quite a difficult transition to make sometimes. As well as thinking about, do we understand the places and spaces that young people are talking to us about? When they're saying this happened here or there, do we even know what that means? How much do we know our community? And that will vary place by place. We know practitioners often go into people's homes, have a look around, they know what they're looking, they think they know what they're looking for, and often they do. This is what we'd be concerned about. But going into a park and walking around, because of our loss of skills around community development, people often don't even know what they'd be looking for in the first place. It can feel really overwhelming to suggest that you'd go in and have a look. So we started to work with practitioners to think about what that might mean, developing animations to help people think that through, as well as ways to engage with larger groups of people. So student surveys, parent surveys, if we're thinking about school environments, business surveys that have been trialled to try to help people think about, how would I be starting to assess what's happening in this place that might be impacting my young person or a group of young people. And I'm just going to play you a short excerpt from the animation to give you a sense of the types of things practitioners have been doing.
What is a neighbourhood observation? Brought to you by the Contextual Safeguarding Network and Hackney Children and Family Service. This short video describes how to carry out a neighbourhood observation as part of a neighbourhood assessment. When social workers or practitioners carry out assessments of children and families, they will often visit the family home and observe the home environment. This might mean getting a sense of what the home is like and observing interactions between children and their parents. Observations of the family home can help practitioners build a picture of what is happening and any potential concerns, but also protective factors and what is working well. This can form the basis of ideas to support families and develop interventions. But what do you do if you are assessing a neighbourhood rather than a family? When assessing a neighbourhood, practitioners need to build a picture of the local area under assessment. What is happening there, and what harm or protective factors may be facilitated by the area itself. Neighbourhood observations can help with this. Neighbourhood observations should be part of neighbourhood assessments, which are concerned with safety and welfare, and therefore are not restricted to the identification of crime and antisocial behaviour. In this sense, they are broader than community safety or policing disruption work, although this may be a feature on occasion, and are more closely aligned to safeguarding young people's welfare. While practitioners may visit the area under assessment for other reasons, such as speaking to local residents or young people, it is important to visit the area for the purpose of specifically observing the local environment. This means visiting and spending time walking around the location. When carrying out a neighbourhood assessment, practitioners want to get a better understanding of what the area is like. For example, what is the area? Is it a large park or an estate? Or is it a very small area such as a stairwell or a specific shop? Are there aspects of the built environment worth noting, such as walkways, the presence of CCTV, or things that may reduce visibility, such as broken lights, bushes, or boarded up areas? But also, what are the strengths of the area? Are there opportunities to increase safety and protect the welfare of young people? Maybe a youth club with activities for young people, or a well-known member of the community who has a relationship with young people. Walking around helps you to become familiar with the area itself. By visiting, practitioners can also consider what the area is being used for, and any evidence of harm or strengths. For example, does the area look worn down? Is there evidence of drug use or alcohol consumption? Are you able to observe anything that might pose a risk to young people? Observations also allow practitioners to engage with the local community and identify potential guardians. Guardians are people in the community who have responsibility in the area and could provide a safeguarding role. For example, a local business owner might know the young people in the area and want to be involved in supporting interventions. Observations can help you to think about who might be part of an intervention and what they might need. For example, safeguarding training or contact details of local services. When carrying out observations, it is important to note down what you see. The Contextual Safeguarding team have developed an observation template to support this. This provides a number of prompts to think about. So, what does this mean in practice? In Hackney, observations allowed practitioners to understand the context in which harm was occurring. In one assessment, following a referral related to concerns of sexual exploitation and drug use in a stairwell, practitioners visited the area and found that the stairwell had limited lighting, the windows were boarded up, and there were no emergency exits. These observations formed the basis of the intervention.
This has brought some practitioners back to being like, oh God, yeah, that's what we were doing anyway, and others being like feeling quite anxious and uncomfortable about it. So it's really important to think about how practitioners in your locality would engage. Do they visit areas anyway? What we found with some practitioners visiting homes, walking straight through an area and not really looking at the area at all, just getting in the car, getting into the house, coming back to the house, not thinking about the built environment around or the route the child has to walk once they leave their front door. So really encouraging engagement in the space is really important. And we're starting to get reports back from different localities who are trying to adopt this type of approach. In one, they were talking about a situation where young people were being groomed into drug dealing and approached outside the local library after a takeaway shop had switched off their Wi-Fi, and they moved from the takeaway shop to the library to access the Wi-Fi. The library had complained about the numbers of young people in the library, which is another discussion altogether. And so there was a visit to the library to understand what was going on and try to put some support in place. And part of that involved observing what was happening around the library and then developing support. And the practitioner reported that looking at responding to young people in this situation through a contextual safeguarding lens allowed all key partners to work together and understand their role in supporting and safeguarding young people in the space. This led to a decrease in antisocial antisocial behaviour, and help to form a stronger relationship between the young people and the library staff, ultimately creating a safer space for young people to socialise. This in turn has had a longer impact on safeguarding young people engaging in this space, as the library staff are more confident in engaging with young people and identifying and raising safeguarding concerns. They initially built a pop-up youth club in the library and then worked with the library staff to maintain the support once the pop-up youth club was no longer there. All of this work has required quite a lot of development of policy in a number of local areas, attempts at thinking about when should we be involved in supporting a friendship group or a location, because you can't intervene with every bus stop where someone's phone is stolen, when do you need to resource more support. So thinking about thresholds, thinking about case management systems. I'm not sure which case management system you use here. Liquid Logic, so they are currently embedding some of the contextual recommendations into their system, because all the new test sites use Liquid Logic, so that you can start to record some more of these things on the case management system. But we also had to seek legal advice from a QC around peer assessment and peer mapping, and that legal advice is available to ensure that it was appropriate, and always holding children's rights in mind as that work continues, as well as thinking about information sharing frameworks for engaging a much wider pool of partners in meetings, particularly meetings about locations, not meetings about individuals. So if you want the pharmacy to attend and you want the residents association to attend, how do you ensure that that can happen safely and lead to planning? So at the moment, we're currently testing in these localities, Bristol, Kent, Knowsley, Swansea, Wiltshire, and then 4 London boroughs. We have another 25 localities who are testing without our presence, and we're kind of engaging with them at arm's length to build in learning about what people are doing when they don't have the team supporting them. And we tend to work with areas through a 3-stage process. The first is to create what contextual safeguarding looks like for them in their own operating framework, so to what extent they already do this, and what changes they would want to make to create that version of their system. We then run that through a series of tests before thinking about the learning from the tests and supporting them to think about how they would embed that across their services. Some of the things that we've seen change in some localities is a shift in how social care in particular are engaging with these. A number of young people who were previously closed are receiving some form of support in some test sites. Some localities have made a decision to use child protection on this, but not all of them at all, when there are significant risks, particularly around firearms use towards young people. And we're tending to find that it's the front door in most localities that we work with where the key decisions are made, and once they get through that process, the wider system is able to respond appropriately. But there are ongoing questions about particularly what you do when a young person is at risk of harm but also open to your youth justice service, and what happens when their order ends but safeguarding concern remains, and how to manage those needs. But we are seeing shifts in practitioner language in assessments. In some test sites, for example, this practitioner feeling the need to quite explicitly talk about the fact that the family home has provided a stable upbringing for this young person with parents who love and care for him, but given the levels of need in place, a child protection process was going to be used because the young person had made disclosures about retaliative attacks that involved firearms. And the parents really welcomed this level of support. They wanted that level of coordination because they felt that they kind of were at a loss about what to do, and welcomed the support they got from a social worker. Also seeing plans referencing the need to create safe spaces or identify safe spaces where the young person can be in order to achieve safety for them, rather than solely developing plans for the child and or the family. So these small tweaks in language seem to be making a difference. Also engaging with social workers and wider practitioners about what this means. And we're seeing social workers engaging in 3 key elements of core work: advocating on behalf of young people and their families for change to occur in extra-familial settings, so advocating for an intervention in a public place or in a school. One young woman who was assaulted on the school bus, for example, advocating that the bus company take steps to support her so that she could feel safe in travelling to and from school. So there's been a need for kind of sometimes brokerage of relationships where things feel too big for families to get hold of themselves, and coordinating what can be quite complex plans and systems to create safety in public spaces. But this absolutely hasn't been about social workers becoming detached youth workers, housing officers and security staff. This is about forging those links and holding everyone very focused on the plan at hand being about safeguarding the welfare of that child or group of children, rather than disrupting this bit of crime or reducing antisocial behaviour here. These are after effects of that. It's also encouraging staff to state when they just don't know what to do, and often being a fear in some localities that they always had to find something to do, and if it felt too overwhelming, then they retreated back to the parents need to do this or the child needs to do that because they didn't know what to do. And actually saying, well, actually this is really hard and we don't know what to do, and we need the partners involved because it's really complicated, has been very important. And using multi-agency meetings to advocate and raise concerns about context as well as about children and families is really important. And much of this in some areas is still framed around preventing family breakdown, because what we are seeing is kind of, if we're not acting and getting in sooner, the family feeling completely unable to cope, particularly around criminal exploitation. So just to finish up, in terms of the national picture on this, we are engaging with a series of key stakeholders around the work. We host a UK advisory panel on contextual safeguarding that's chaired by Des Holmes, and that meets twice a year. Government departments from England, Wales and Scotland attend that meeting, as well as regulators and practice associations to discuss the learning that's emerging from test sites and the needs that relate to policy and legislation. We also have a voluntary and community sector collective who are meeting to discuss changes being made within voluntary organisations to accommodate some of this thinking. We know large children's charities like Barnardo's and the Children's Society are engaging with this, but so are a number of small organisations, and we're trying to ensure that those small and medium-sized organisations have the support they need. And we also host a local authority implementation group for local authorities to come together who are trying to implement this so that they can share peer learning and develop sector-led learning around the work. As was mentioned at the start, contextual safeguarding is in working together to safeguard children in two key ways. The first way is the section called Contextual Safeguarding that references the different forms of extra-familial harm, are forms of abuse, but also that plans need to address the environmental factors attached to those forms of harm and not just the children and families affected by them. The other way in which it's included, however, is in 5 sentence changes in the document that, if you're a geek like me, you analyse pre and post consultation documents and you find them. So in terms of contextual safeguarding, these are the 5. There was an insertion in relation to early help services, stating that they could also be offered in response to emerging thematic concerns in context, not just in relation to children and families. There was a line added around information sharing related to children who appear associated to the same contexts or locations, not just children associated through familial links. There's a reference to social work assessment, needing to understand the level of need and risk in or faced by a family, and the previous version had only said in a family, which is quite important in the sense of being able to look outside and encouraging people to do that more consistently. For partner organisations to have arrangements in place for creating a culture of safety, equality and protection within the services they provide. That applies to things like leisure and transport services, for example, who may be providing services for young people. And for context impacting the welfare of young people open to youth justice services, also needing to be flagged within partnership agencies. I hope it's been a helpful introduction for you and giving you some things to think about. We do run a practice network, and I know a number of your staff are members. It's completely free for people to join, and they can access all of the resources that I've talked about today and will be notified when new resources are published. We also support a local interest network of localities who are testing the approach in England and Wales but aren't formal members of the implementation group, to try to support them to encourage each other and share learning. And they tend to be grouped around kind of large geographical localities or regions or localities with specific needs. So as they develop their work, we will begin to publish their learning on the network. So I hope that's been helpful, and I'm happy to take any questions before lunch.